Well, the European Commission has announced a €120 million aid package for Gaza in the current year. But when it comes to rebuilding the shattered territory, as we just heard, that's a drop in the bucket. Meanwhile, the question of who will govern the Gaza Strip remains unresolved.
Destruction everywhere. More than 2/3 of Gaza's buildings damaged or destroyed, from government offices to houses and beyond. News of the ceasefire brought relief in Gaza and cautious hope for the first phase of the truce.
When I return, I will start my life anew because everything we had was destroyed and our future was swept away like the wind. We will build a new future from scratch.
An estimated 90% of Gazans have been displaced during the war. They'll finally be able to start coming home from the tent cities and open-air camps that have housed them. But they face significant challenges. Many apartment blocks have been flattened by Israeli bombs. Safe drinking water is in short supply, and most of the infrastructure is in ruins.
You have this 75% of Gaza's buildings fully or partially destroyed. You have no economy, no infrastructure, no education, no healthcare. And so you're going to have a desolate territory with desperate populations that are hanging on by a thread. Yes, the absence of war is positive, but with Hamas being solely in control is going to be a disaster for the future of the Gaza Strip and indeed the Palestinian National Project.
The Israeli military will leave most of Gaza for a so-called buffer zone, about 1 kilometer wide along the border with Israel. The IDF will also occupy the strip of land called the Netzarim corridor that separates North and South Gaza. And it will keep control of the Philadelphia corridor, a zone along the border with Egypt, to deter arms smuggling. Humanitarian aid will again flow into the besieged territory, where international agencies have warned famine may have taken hold. 600 food trucks are scheduled to deliver aid every day once the ceasefire takes effect. However, looting of aid has emerged as a major problem. And over the course of the war, Israel has imposed inspections on trucks that have slowed deliveries. The first steps are supposed to take place in the days and weeks to come. Reconstruction will take years or decades, and the territory's political future is still unclear.
Well, for more, I'm joined now by Rosalia Bolin, who works for UNICEF in Gaza. Thanks for being with us, Rosalia. I understand you're in Al-Mawazi in the southwest of the Gaza Strip at the moment. What are people in Gaza telling you about the ceasefire deal? What are their hopes? What are their expectations?
You know, here in southern Gaza and Al-Mawasi, it doesn't really feel or sound like a ceasefire yet. This morning I woke up to the very strong buzz of drones flying over, so that continues unabated. 2 nights ago, the news of a deal to secure a ceasefire was received with tremendous joy, just an outpouring of joy and jubilation. You know, people are longing for an end to this war. They want to go back to their homes to see what's left of it. Children I speak to tell me that they long to sleep in their beds. They want their bedrooms. They want to see what's left of it. So everyone is very desperate and hopeful. But at the same time, the attacks continue to be reported. Dozens continue to be killed or have been reported killed, including at least 20 children over the past 24, 48 hours or so.
The international community has promised an aid surge into Gaza once the ceasefire is established. There are trucks on their way. What are you expecting in terms of aid deliveries, assuming the deal is approved?
So that's a very important point, because people here in Gaza, families suffer not just because of the relentless attacks, because of the bombs and the bullets, but also because of the utter deprivation that they've been living through over the past 15 months. You know, children, they're cold. They walk around in summer clothes. They don't have proper clothes. Their shelters aren't protecting them from the cold and the rain. They live in makeshift tents. They haven't had a proper meal for well over a year. Families live of canned food and flour. Healthcare has been decimated. Children have been out of school for 1 year and a half. So the needs are immense. And that's why it's important that aid can enter the Gaza Strip, but not just aid. We also need the commercial sector to be able to bring in supplies. Organizations like my own, like UNICEF, when it comes to things like nutrition, we actually have been bringing in high energy biscuits, therapeutic food, so nutritional supplements for children who are most vulnerable, children suffering from malnutrition. But ultimately, if the private sector could actually bring in supplies at scale, if they could bring in food, dairy products, food, vegetables in large volumes in parallel, that would actually help address one of these very pressing issues of malnutrition. So it's important that both happen simultaneously, a surge in aid and a surge in commercial supplies. But the ceasefire by itself isn't a guarantee that that will happen automatically. There's a large range of access constraints that need to be addressed. The operational environment has to be improved for us to be able to bring aid in, but also once it reaches Gaza, for us to distribute it to families in need.
What is most needed for the children of Gaza right now?
Right now, I would say an immediate halt in the fighting. That sound of the drones flying over, that has to stop. Children have been exposed to violence for over 15 months. Many children have been killed. At least 14,500 children are reported killed. Tens of thousands more have been injured, some with life-changing injuries. I've met quite a few children whose legs and other limbs have been amputated. I've met children who now are blind as a result of airstrikes on their homes. So that has to stop. And equally, this would help children, or would give children an opportunity to recover psychologically, because the suffering is not just physical, it's also psychological. Children have been exposed to this violence permanently, but they've also been stuck in this cycle of very toxic stress. Children are acutely aware that nowhere is safe in Gaza. Children speak about death. For instance, this child that I met who lost his eyesight, he had a skull fracture in an airstrike on his home. I asked what happened to him, and he said there was an airstrike, many people were killed, and the airstrike also killed his eyes. He said, my eyes went to heaven before I did. This was a 5-year-old boy who also sustained very severe burns all over his body. So every single child in Gaza today is in need of psychosocial support. They need to be able to get services, mental health services, to process the very traumatic experiences they've lived and the feelings associated with that. And for that, we need the ceasefire to materialize and for both sides to adhere to it.
Now, you've been in Gaza since October of last year, I understand, Rosalia. I can't imagine what that must have been like, what that's been like for you. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's affected you personally to be there during that time?
It's been a few very tough months indeed, especially because since my arrival, despite the interventions that humanitarian actors like UNICEF make, at times I couldn't help but think that the situation was only deteriorating. Something that I felt was really, really difficult was to speak with children who were visibly in lots of pain. For instance, I met an 11-year-old boy with leukemia in Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis back in October, and he was actually too weak to speak to me. He could barely look me in the eye. He was just laying on a children's cots in the children's ward of that hospital, and he was whimpering in pain. The hospital wasn't able to give him any treatment. He was suffering from leukemia, but was also unable largely to alleviate his pain. And that really, seeing those children in such great suffering is something that is honestly unbearable. These children, they did not start this war, and they also don't have the power to end it and to to change anything about their situation. So it's been a couple of very, very difficult months. What we see here is honestly undescribable. I came to Gaza before the war in a different capacity with the UN. And when I entered after the war started, I couldn't believe my eyes, because you enter through the south, through Kerem Shalom, and then you drive through Khan Yunis, and there's just nothing left of the city that used to be Khan Yunis. It's just sand and rubble. It looks like a moon landscape. I've no better word to describe it. The scale of the destruction is just unimaginable, and families here have lost everything.
Rosalia, we want to thank you for speaking with us today. That was Rosalia Bolin, a spokeswoman for UNICEF, speaking to us from Gaza.
Thank you for having me.
Well, for more, let's cross over to journalist Kristen Hellberg. She's an expert on the Middle East. Kristen, the agreement on the table includes different phases. Walk us through how this is supposed to unfold, this deal.
Well, actually, both sides have quite an interest in getting through this first phase, which foresees 42 days of ceasefire, 6 weeks, which means the release of 33 hostages, among them 2 Americans, among them several female soldiers, in exchange to several hundred Palestinian prisoners. There is supposed to be a withdrawal of Israeli forces from densely populated areas, and humanitarian aid is supposed to reach the Gaza Strip on a high scale. Now, within this first phase, they are supposed to start negotiations of the second phase, and this is really the breaking point, I would say.
So there are 3 phases, though. The final one is supposed to kind of set up the future for Gaza and bring about a more lasting peace. How difficult do you think it'll be to get to that phase?
Well, the most difficult part is the second phase, which would include the end of the war in Gaza, which means a permanent ceasefire and a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. And this is something that the Israeli government refuses at this point, because they are saying that for security reasons, they want to stay in the different buffer zones in the Philadelphia corridor, in the Netzarim corridor between northern and southern Gaza. So this is really the point where I'm very skeptical that this will happen. And then the third phase, if they get to this, would be that the final bodies of dead Israeli hostages would be released and the reconstruction of Gaza is supposed to begin. So difficult, again, the end of the war, and who's supposed to take over the control and the administration in Gaza.
Exactly. That reconstruction governance phase, there's a huge question mark over that if we get that far. There's a lot of speculation about Gaza's post-war future and who will govern the territory. What do you see as the most likely scenario if we get there?
If everybody agrees that Hamas is not supposed to play a role or to control Gaza in the future, there have to be discussions on an alternative. Now, the Palestinian Authority is supposed to take over the administration, but it lacks legitimacy among the Palestinian people. It controls the West Bank and it has to be reformed, which means that there needs to be an exchange in the leadership. Young politicians, a technocratic government should take over. And there is one very popular political figure, Marwan Barghouti, who is in jail. Hamas demanded his release for this prisoner exchange in the first phase. And it is to be seen whether someone like Marwan Barghouti, who used to be from Fatah, the Palestinian Authorities Party in the past, who played a prominent role during the Second Intifada, he's like a national hero for Palestinians. He would be a person who could unite really these Palestinian efforts. Hamas has to agree to a certain point to a post-war scenario to not be able to act as a spoiler. So how to exclude Hamas while at the same time getting their approval of a transitional phase that should be led by the Palestinian Authority, new politicians, and backed by the international community and the UN, obviously.
There are reports that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have been talking in Cairo with each other. What do you make of that?
They have been trying to reconcile over the last months. There were several meetings in Moscow. Even China was involved. They have not reached an agreement and this reconciliation. They haven't done so for years. The question is whether with this chance of uniting the Gaza Strip with the West Bank again, they would be able to reconcile and to find a solution, as I said, with the approval of Hamas without being part of a post-war scenario and an administration in Gaza. And then the big question is, who is supposed to secure this internationally? The role of Arab states, is there any chance of foreign powers to play a constructive role here?
What happens in Gaza is of great importance for the world as a whole, but particularly for other countries in the region. How do those Arab countries in the region look at these latest developments in Gaza and look to the future? What are they hoping for?
Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge the role of Qatar and Egypt in these negotiations. So it was, again, their efforts over many months to come to this agreement. Obviously, the whole region wants this problem to be settled. They understood that they cannot just negotiate agreements with Israel, bilateral agreements like the United Arab Emirates did and Morocco did and Bahrain did in the Abraham Accords over the heads of the Palestinians. This will not be able to be repeated. We saw on October 7th what would be the result. The Palestinians have to gain their sovereignty. So it all depends on Saudi Arabia, because this would be like the big price from an Israeli perspective to get a normalization with Saudi Arabia. This is on Trump's agenda, definitely for his term to come. So the question is, will Saudi Arabia insist on the existence of a sovereign Palestinian state before agreeing to normalization with Israel? And the questions on the short term, obviously, is who is ready to engage in the control of the Gaza Strip, for example, the United Arab Emirates and Egypt. There have been talks about putting some soldiers or even troops on the ground to control who is going from southern Gaza to northern Gaza to control the checkpoints there. I would say that any Arab involvement would insist on a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces. This is the precondition. So the question is very much if Israel is ready to agree to this, and if an international community would give Israel the feeling of security, it needs to agree to such a new autonomy from the Palestinian side, backed by the Arab states and backed by the international community.
Kristen Hellberg, journalist and expert on the Middle East, thank you very much.
My pleasure.